All right, let's get right into it. Today, we are embarking on a truly profound intellectual journey into the historical record of African civilization, specifically before European colonization. For centuries, the narrative surrounding the African continent has been filtered through this extraordinarily narrow lens, leaving a vast, incredibly rich legacy buried beneath layers of misconception. While our goal in this explainer is to completely set aside those filters. By drawing directly upon the groundbreaking scholarly research of Sheikh Anta Diop in his work Precolonial Black Africa, and Chancellor Williams in The Destruction of Black Civilization, we're going to look at the true, defossilized historical record. We'll be exploring the staggering sophistication of ancient African empires, the really unique governance structures, the relentless forces that eventually shattered them, and the systematic academic crusade that sought to bury their memory. To start things off, we really have to confront a deeply entrenched myth. Ask yourself this: did African history truly begin with European contact? For generations, mainstream Western education has heavily implied, if not outright stated as fact, that Africa was just a land without a structured past, lacking history or civilization until foreign ships arrived on its shores. Confronting this is the foundation of our exploration today, because the stakes here are incredibly high. We're not just rattling off dates and places. We are challenging a pervasive myth that has shaped global consciousness for centuries. And we're going to do it simply by letting the meticulous historical documentation speak for itself. The great Senegalese scholar Sheikh Anta Diop understood the sheer gravity of this task perfectly. He wrote, "Therefore it had become indispensable to unfreeze, in a manner of speaking, to defossilize that African history which was there at hand, lifeless, imprisoned in the documents." Diop's mission, and really ours today, is to breathe life back into a history that has been scientifically documented but basically ignored. He argued that the records of Africa's greatness were always there, right? But they were kept lifeless, intentionally locked away in archives and ancient texts. And the fact that these records were locked away brings us directly to the crucial findings of historian Chancellor Williams. In his extensive research, Williams presents a deeply sobering argument. He says the erasure of African history wasn't just a mere accident of time. No, it was a systematic academic crusade. He documents how a deliberate historical blackout was engineered. According to his analysis, early Western historians and institutions actively worked to delete, disguise, or belittle the role of Black people in world history. By controlling the fields of education and research, they essentially rewrote the origins of human civilization. Okay, let's dive right into this first part. The actual sophistication of these African empires, moving way beyond the myth of a primitive past. The structured reality of these massive sovereign states is just undeniable once you look at the records. When we examine empires like ancient Kemet, which we know as Egypt, Nubia, Mali, Songhai, alongside others like Kongo and Great Zimbabwe, we see a level of organization that rivals any major civilization in human history. These were absolutely not scattered, chaotic tribes. We're talking about sprawling empires boasting immense economic wealth, sophisticated trade networks, and incredible intellectual achievements, including extensive written archives and formalized administrative ministries. The historical record completely, 100% shatters the Western perception of an unorganized pre-colonial Africa. Let's talk about their economies for a second, specifically the sheer, mind-boggling abundance of gold. Diop notes a really fascinating historical detail here. The very etymology of the word Nubia is said to signify gold. It was the primary source from which Egypt acquired its immense wealth. Further west, Diop documents the staggering gold economy of the Ghana Empire. The king of Ghana managed vast state-controlled reserves in the fortified city of Giaru. The abundance was so great that the king actually left all the gold dust to the people, but strictly kept all the solid pieces of native gold for the royal treasury. Without this vital economic precaution, Diop notes, gold would have lost its value entirely. That right there, that is the hallmark of a highly sophisticated, centrally managed state economy. Now, these documents also brilliantly dismantle another massive myth, the idea that African history was exclusively oral. The records reveal a highly literate society. Scholars in the Sudan and across the Niger Bend literally sacrificed their own wealth to build immense hereditary libraries. Writing and calligraphy were elevated to celebrated art forms, much like you'd see in Europe during the Middle Ages. Judicial and administrative archives were meticulously kept, with assistants literally taking minutes of official sessions. Cities like Timbuktu and Janneh weren't just simple settlements. They were thriving, international, cosmopolitan hubs of commerce and academia. So, Having established their economic and intellectual power, let's shift our focus to the second major theme, matrilineal power, and the deeply rooted African traditions that maintained their stability. Diop points out that to truly understand African social organization, you absolutely must understand matrilineal succession. In this system, royal succession and inheritance do not pass from father to son like we're used to seeing. Instead, they trace strictly through the maternal line. This means a ruling sovereign is succeeded by his sister's son, his nephew. And this wasn't some localized quirk or anomaly. This was a foundational constitutional law operating across massive, deeply diverse empires. You can see this strict adherence to the law fully evidenced in the 11th century empire of Ghana. In Diop's documentation of the historian Bokri's accounts from 1067, we learn that the Emperor Tunka did not inherit the throne from his father. Rather, he succeeded his maternal uncle Bessie. And the justification given by the people was profoundly pragmatic. A king can be absolutely certain that his sister's son shares his bloodline, right? But he can never be entirely certain about the son he considers his own. It was a biologically foolproof system of maintaining the royal lineage. Diop contrasts this directly with the European patriarchal model, where power traces exclusively through male heirs. The African system was rooted in what is termed the vitalist concept. Basically, this is the idea that the universe operates in a strict metaphysical order, and political power is intrinsically tied to the maternal line, which guarantees the continuation of the vital force. This created a distinctly different social organization. It provided a natural balance of power, embedding a democratic, egalitarian ethos right into the very fabric of African aristocracy. It's a stark contrast to the absolute patriarchal monarchies developing simultaneously over in Europe. Which brings us to our third section, and a critical, unavoidable question. If these societies were so profoundly sophisticated, wealthy, and structurally sound, what forces dismantled them? Chancellor Williams answers this by mapping out a timeline of relentless, agonizing destruction that actually traces its roots all the way back to 4500 BC. The splintering of African civilization wasn't a single, catastrophic event, but a continuous, brutal process of invasion lasting thousands of years. The first major wave of internal turmoil and foreign invasions into the Egyptian cradle began around 2181 BC. This was followed by the Hyksos rule in 1645 BC, sweeping Arab conquests in the 13th century AD, and finally culminating in the devastating European colonialism of the 19th century. To survive this unrelenting onslaught, African populations had to make tragic, fundamental changes to their way of life. Williams outlines the mechanics of this survival, which he calls the splintering effect. Just imagine it. To escape invading forces, people had to flee their permanent settlements. For security, they sought out the most hidden, isolated areas they could possibly find. This desperate migration shattered massive, unified empires into small, isolated units. And over centuries of being cut off from one another, these isolated groups eventually forgot their shared origins. That is how you get the development of over 2,000 completely independent dialects and languages over time. And this highlights a devastating historical irony. The very actions African peoples took to survive, fleeing, splintering, and isolating, became their greatest vulnerability. Disunity and mutual suspicion replaced the vast, powerful confederations of the past. As Williams writes, small chiefdoms spring up everywhere, sometimes no larger than a single village. This fragmented, highly localized continent was rendered entirely vulnerable to the organized exploitation, enslavement, and conquest that followed from Asia and Europe. Finally, we reach Section 4, the academic cover-up. This is perhaps the most insidious chapter of this timeline, looking at how Western academia treated the remnants of these shattered civilizations in the modern era. Williams argues that as the physical conquest of Africa was completed, an intellectual conquest began. He lays out the tactics of what he calls the historical blackout. Institutions heavily financed African studies associations, deliberately maintaining strict white control over the narratives. When classical ancient historians like Herodotus stated plainly that the original Egyptians were black, modern academics simply dismissed them as unreliable. Most effectively, they engaged in a massive campaign of reclassifying populations and rewriting geography, deliberately trying to prove that the architects of Africa's greatest monuments were somehow disconnected from the black race. A crucial point here is how easily history can be hidden simply through the power of naming. Williams points out a comparison that perfectly illustrates this, and it's wild. The ancient African name for the spectacular university city and capital of Upper Ethiopia was Wose, or Nawe. The Greeks renamed it Thebes.
and suddenly its African identity was obscured. The native name for the entire civilization was Kem, meaning literally the Black Land. The West renamed it Egypt. By simply blotting out original African names and imposing Greek, Roman, or Arabic ones, academics effectively erased the true originators of these majestic civilizations from the global history books.
So as we wrap up this explainer, we return to the monumental task left to us by scholars like Diop and Williams. The historical record is no longer completely fossilized, The evidence of immense sophistication, complex governance, and tragic fragmentation is right there, available for those willing to look past the academic blackout. The structures of pre-colonial Black Africa tell a story of incredible resilience, intellect, and profound human achievement. The records are there, they're waiting. So the final question is, will you heed the call to dig deeper, challenge the established narratives, and finally unbury the truth of your origin story? Thank you for joining me, and keep exploring.